Okay. All right. Okay, well, we kind of finished our chemical foundation, but let's take a look. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a summary chart of some of the key properties of the biological polymers, the large polymers of life, what they are, what they're made of, and the like. And that's just a quick and dirty overview, and then we'll probably touch a little bit onto some of the other onto sugars and polysaccharides at the end of this. So let's take a look at our little summary chart here. What I'm going to do is make several different kinds of columns here. Bring it on over here, I guess. All right. Okay, here's our four major classes of biological polymers. I'm going to take just a quick summary look at them before we actually start looking at these things in more detail. First of all, what kinds of subunit small organic molecules are they made of? Second of all, are they overall polar or hydrophobic? Third thing, what is their biological functions? Okay, let's take a look at these things. Polysaccharides, the term saccharide refers to sugars. So polysaccharides are made of sugars. And sugars are, of course, not surprising because they're quite soluble in water. Sugars are very polar, so therefore polysaccharides are highly polar molecules. Now, polysaccharides play a number of different roles in the cell. They are sources of energy. They can be metabolized by processes like glycolysis and Krebs cycle and what have you to generate a lot of metabolic energy. Polysaccharides can be broken down to sugars, and then the sugars metabolized. Polysaccharides can also be used for energy storage. Store them as polysaccharides, break them down when needed. Other polysaccharides are structural materials. Think of cellulose and chitin. Those are used for things like cell walls of plants and fungi, and different kinds of body parts in arthropods. Arthropod exoskeletons are made mostly of chitin. So we can say they play structural roles both at the cellular and at the organismal level. And then finally, a sort of hidden function of polysaccharides is that many polysaccharides are covalently bonded to proteins or lipids and serve as flags or recognition markers, telling the rest of the cell or other cells what kind of molecule it is. And that recognition function that's kind of hidden is actually very important. It allows certain molecules to be routed and sorted and put in the right parts of the cell, in the right places and things like that. It's very important in cells recognizing other cells, sticking together, or in some cases your immune system attacking cells that have the wrong kinds of polysaccharides are recognized as foreign and your immune system goes after them, things like that. So we can say overall big role is molecular recognition. Okay, lipids. Lipids are made of a variety of different things. Some of the major categories are made of a molecule called glycerol, more on that later, covalently attached to fatty acids, which are hydrocarbon chains with what we call a polar organic acid group at one end. So a lot of them are made of glycerol and fatty acids, but that's not always the case. Some are types of molecules known as sterols, which are multiple ring-shaped molecules, and then there are things of other compositions. There are numerous different kinds of lipids. Okay, now, one thing about lipids is lipids are all hydrophobic. Some lipids may have polar ends to it, but overall the molecules are very hydrophobic. Okay, functions of lipids. Questions back there?
I can't read it.
Oh,
That's just,
what part?
in the sub part of the lipid.
In this?
No, left.
Oh, this part?
Yeah.
Okay, some subunits. Some are made of glycerol and are called fatty acids. More on that later. Some are a kind of molecule called a sterol, which is a multiple ring, four interlocking rings of carbons. And then there are other kinds as well. Okay. And the functions, energy storage. Oh, well, I haven't got the functions of lipids yet. Where are the functions of lipids? One of the major functions is energy storage. Metabolizing lipids, specifically kinds that we call fats and oils, that generates a great deal of metabolic energy. So it's a great way of storing a lot of metabolic energy in a small place. Now, some of us obviously probably do too good of a job of that, taking in more calories than one actually uses up in the course of the day. And what happens, the excess energy's being used in many cases to make lipids, and you store them in certain types of tissues in large amounts. And then you get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so energy storage is a big thing with lipids. A very critical function of lipids is that many lipids, since they're hydrophobic, they can join together to form cell membranes. Cell membranes are these hydrophobic barriers from the cell in the outside world or from one cell compartment to the next. So, cell membranes are made predominantly of lipids. But many other lipids function in cellular regulation, either at the level of the cell, or some of these lipids are secreted into the organism's bloodstream or body fluids, and they affect cells all over the entire organism. Think of steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are all different types of sterol lipids. And steroids have wide-ranging effects on many different cell types. There are other lipids. Think of prostaglandins. These are lipids involved in inflammation. When they're produced and released, the cells nearby start, you get inflammatory responses and things like that. Drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen and naproxen and the high-power prescription-only versions inhibit the synthesis of prostaglandins. So that's why they reduce fever. That's why they reduce the sensations of pain and inflammation and what have you. So many lipids are involved in cellular or organismal regulation. We'll just put regulation down here. All right. Now, nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, they're polymers of what are called nucleotides. And nucleotides are made of a 5-carbon sugar, a phosphate-ion, and a base. In other words, one of those single or double nitrogen-rich rings. ATP is an example of a modified nucleotide. It has a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. It has not just one, but 3 phosphate ions, and it has the base adenine. So, nucleotides themselves are polymers: sugar, phosphate, and a base. Okay, now, nucleotides are very polar molecules. There's all kinds of polar groups coming off of these guys. So, nucleotides are polar. They dissolve very nicely in water. Therefore, nucleic acids are very polar molecules. Now, what kinds of functions do nucleic acids have? Well, DNA, we all know, is the genetic material. It's the genetic blueprint or genome. So we'll put the term genome down here. RNA has many diverse roles, mostly involved in things to do with manipulating and utilizing the genetic material. For instance, RNAs are involved in protein synthesis. Ribosomes, the protein synthesis factories, are made mostly of large RNA molecules. There are many RNAs that play regulatory roles in regulating the activation of genes and things like that. More on that later, but RNAs play very many diverse genetic-related roles. So we'll say genetic regulation. How about that? That sounds pretty good. And we'll see more when we talk about nucleic acids. Now, proteins. Last but certainly not least, and we'll spend a few days on these guys. Proteins are polymers of amino acids. Amino acids, there's a wide range of different kinds of amino acids. 20 of them are used in proteins, and there's thousands of potential amino acids. Some are actually produced in cells that have other functions than being incorporated into proteins. More on that later. But amino acids all have certain key structural features with them. Okay. Now, most amino acids are polar. There are some hydrophobic amino acids. In fact, our enzyme lab, we're going to use a hydrophobic amino acid. And it's a pain in the butt to get in solution because it's not very soluble. It's a fairly hydrophobic molecule. The majority of proteins are polar, at least on the surface. That means they will exist in an aqueous environment. But there are some proteins that have lots of hydrophobic amino acids on the surface, and those you find inside cell membranes. So we'll say mostly polar, but there are some hydrophobic proteins as well. Those are usually our membrane proteins. Okay, what do proteins do? Perhaps we should ask what do proteins not do, because it might be a shorter list. Proteins are involved in all kinds of different things. The majority of our enzymes are proteins. There are some RNA enzymes, but most of them are proteins. So they do most of the catalytic reactions in cells. Much of cell structure is made of proteins. In fact, a lot of organismal structure is due to certain types of proteins. All kinds of different regulatory events. Proteins are involved in regulating other proteins. Proteins can determine whether things get in or out of cells. Genes are largely regulated by proteins binding to specific regions in front of the genes. In other words, what we call transcription factors and things like promoters and enhancer sequences. Those of you who remember genetics, you probably, hopefully they touched on some of that. So many of these things that regulate the activation of genes are protein molecules that bind specific DNA sequences. Okay, so regulation at the cellular level, at the genetic level, what have you. And proteins play critical roles in what we call cell signaling. Cell signaling is when a cell detects something in the outside world, kind of like the sense organs of a cell, and then responds to that. You have a question, right? Oh, sorry. No, you got a question. Okay. All right. Okay, so we'll say cell signaling, which is critically important in cellular function. Okay, so that's sort of a little summary list of the major properties of these large biological polymers. Nice little quick and dirty guide here.